Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 3, Chapter 7, The Battle of the Somme. Pray God that you may never know the hell where youth and laughter go. By Siegfried Sassoon. A sense of the inevitable broods over the battlefields of the Somme. The British armies were so ardent, their leaders so confident, the need and appeals of our allies so clement, and decisive results seemingly so near, that no human power could have prevented the attempt. All the spring the French had been battling and dying at Verdun, emulating their manhood upon that anvil altar. Every chivalrous instinct in the new British armies called them to the succor of France, and inspired them with sacrifice and daring. Brusilov's surprising successes redoubled, if that were possible, the confidence of the British generals. They were quite sure they were going to break their enemy and rupture his invading lines in France. They trusted to the devotion of their troops, which they knew was boundless. They trusted to masses of artillery and shells never before accumulated in war, and they launched their attack in the highest sense of duty and the strongest conviction of success. The military conceptions underlying the scheme of attack were characterized by simplicity. The policy of the French and British commanders had selected as the point for their offensive what was undoubtedly the strongest and most perfectly defended position in the world. During nearly 2 years' preparation, Sir Douglas Haig's dispatches, by J. H. Boriston, pages 22 and 23, he, the enemy, had spared no pains to render these defences impregnable. The first and second systems each consisted of several lines of deep trenches, well provided with bomb-proof shelters and with numerous communication trenches connecting them. The front of the trenches in each system was protected by wire entanglements, many of them in 2 belts 40 yards broad, built of iron stakes interlaced with barbed wire, often almost as thick as a man's finger. The numerous woods and villages in and between these systems of defense had been turned into veritable fortresses. The deep cellars usually to be found in the villages and the numerous pits and quarries common to a chalk country were used to provide cover for machine guns and trench mortars. The existing cellars were supplemented by elaborate dugouts, sometimes in 2 stories, and these were connected by passages as much as 30 feet below the surface of the ground. The salients in the enemy's line, from which he could bring enfilade fire across his front, were made into self-contained forts and often protected by minefields, while strong redoubts and concrete machine gun emplacements had been constructed in positions from which he could sweep his own trenches should these be taken. The ground lent itself to good artillery observation on the enemy's part, and he had skillfully arranged for crossfire by his guns. These various systems of defense, with the fortified localities and other supporting points between them, were cunningly sited to afford each other mutual assistance and to admit of the utmost possible development of enfilade and flanking fire by machine guns and artillery. They formed, in short, not merely a series of successive lines, but one composite system of enormous depth and strength. Behind his second system of trenches, in addition to woods, villages, and other strong points prepared for defense, the enemy had several other lines already completed, and we had learned from aeroplane reconnaissance that he was hard at work improving and strengthening these and digging fresh ones between them, and still farther back. All these conditions clearly indicated to the staffs a suitable field for our offensive, and it was certain that if the enemy were defeated here, he would be more disheartened than by being overcome upon some easier battleground. Sir Douglas also describes his own preparations, which were thorough and straightforward. Footnote: in Sir Douglas Haig's Dispatches by J.H. Boriston, page 21. End of footnote. Vast stocks of ammunition and stores of all kinds had to be accumulated beforehand within a convenient distance of our front. To deal with these many miles of new railways, both standard and narrow gauge, and trench tramways were laid. All available roads were improved, many others were made, and long causeways were built over marshy valleys. Scores of miles of deep communication trenches had to be dug, as well as trenches for telephone wires, assembly and assault trenches, and numerous gun emplacements and observation posts. Thus there was no chance of surprise. Nothing could be introduced to obscure the plain trial of strength between the armies, or diminish the opportunities for valor on the part of the assaulting troops. For months the Germans had observed the vast uncamouflaged preparations proceeding opposite the sector of attack. For a week a preliminary bombardment of varying but unexampled intensity had lashed their trenches with its scourge of steel and fire. Crouched in their deep chalk caves, the stubborn German infantry, short often through the cannonade of food and water, awaited the signal to man their broken parapets. The lanes which the British shrapnel had laboriously cut through their barbed wire entanglements were all carefully studied, and machine guns were accurately sighted to sweep them or traverse the approaches with flanking fire. Even one machine gun in skilled, resolute hands might lay 500 men dead and dying on the ground, and along the assaulted front certainly 1,000 such weapons, scientifically related in several lines of defense, awaited their prey. Afar, the German gunners, unmolested by counter-battery, stood ready to release their defending barrages on the British front lines, on their communication trenches and places of assembly. Colonel Boriston's account is studiously vague as to the objectives sought for by his chief on July 1. The plan of the British and French was admittedly to pierce the whole German trench system on a front of many kilometers, and then, by wheeling outwards, the British to the northeast and north, and the French to the southeast, to roll up from the flanks the exposed portions of the German line. And British and French cavalry divisions were held ready to be pushed forward through the gap so made. The French objective was to gain the rising ground east of the Somme, south of Péronne, while the corresponding British objective was the semicircle of high ground running from the neighborhood of Les Transloy through Bapaume to Achier-les-Grands. Footnote: in Sir Douglas Haig's command, page 93. End of footnote. But these objectives, says Colonel Boriston, were not expected to be reached in the first assault. These Somme positions were objectives for the armies concerned rather than for the troops from time to time engaged in the attack. They marked the stage at which it was thought that the penetration would be deep enough to enable the Allied armies to turn their attention to the second stage of the battle, that is to say, the rolling up of the German forces on the flank of the point of rupture. Footnote: in Sir Douglas Haig's command. End of footnote. It was certainly contemplated from the beginning that the battle would be long and hard fought, but it will be seen that the time factor is thus left altogether indefinite. One remains under the impression that it was comparatively immaterial whether this penetrating advance and outward movement were to be effected in a few days, a week, a fortnight, or even longer. But this argument cannot be sustained. The whole effectiveness of the plan depended on the speed of its execution. If, for instance, an interval of 2 or 3 days intervened between the penetration and the outward wheel, the enemy's line would be switched back on both sides of the gap, and a whole new web of fortifications would obstruct a further advance. All prospects of a great rupture, followed by rolling up the flanks, was dependent upon a rate of progress so rapid as to preclude the construction and organization by the enemy of fresh defensive lines. If the Joffre-Haig plan was to achieve any success apart from mere attrition, progress must be continuous and rapid, and the objectives specified must be attained at the latest in 2 or 3 days. If this were not secured, the great attack would have failed. Other attacks might subsequently be planned and might be locally successful, but the scheme of a grand rupture was definitely at an end. It is easy to prove that rapid progress was in fact contemplated and resolutely bid for. The use by Haig of his artillery clearly indicates the immediate ambitions which were in view. Instead of concentrating the fire on the first lines which were to be assaulted, the British artillery was dispersed in its action over the second and remoter lines and on many strong points far in the rear, the hope clearly being that all these would be reached in the course of the first days or 2 days' fighting. The position of the British and French cavalry in close proximity to the battlefront also reveals indisputably the hopes and expectations of the commanders. At 7 o'clock in the morning of July 1, the British and French armies rose from their trenches, steel-helmeted, gas-masked, equipped with all the latest apparatus of war, bombs, mortars, machine guns, light and heavy, and, supported by all their artillery, marched against the enemy on a front of 45 kilometers. 14 British divisions and 5 French divisions were almost immediately engaged. South of the Somme, on the French front, the Germans were taken completely by surprise. They had not believed the French capable, after their punishment at Verdun, of any serious offensive effort. They expected at the most only demonstrations. They were not ready for the French and the French attack, though, unfortunately on a needlessly small scale, captured and overwhelmed the German troops throughout the whole of their first system of trenches. Very different were the fortunes of the British. Everywhere they found the enemy fully prepared. The 7 days' bombardment had by no means accomplished what had been expected. Safely hidden in the deep dugouts, the defenders and their machine guns were practically intact. From these they emerged with deadly effect at the moment of assault or even after the waves of attack had actually passed over and beyond them. Though the German front line was crossed at every point, the great advance into his position failed except on the right. The 3 British divisions on the flank captured Montauban and Mametz, and an area 4.5 miles wide and 1.5 miles deep, thus isolating Fricourt on the south. The 21st Division north of this village also made progress and gained nearly a mile. But though the defenders of Fricourt were thus almost cut off, the attempt to storm the village failed. Northwards again, the 2 divisions of the 3rd Corps, though they advanced 1,000 yards, failed in spite of repeated efforts to capture La Boisselle, or Auvilliers, on the long spurs of the Pourzières Plateau. By nightfall, the gain in this part of the field comprised only 2 pockets of bulges in the enemy's position. The attack of the 10th Corps with 3 divisions broke down before the immense defenses of the Thiepval spur and plateau. Although 2 of its great supporting points, the Leipzig and Schwaben redoubts, were captured, all attacks on Thiepval failed. and the failure to take Thiepval entailed the evacuation of the Schwaben. Opposite Beaumont-Hamel, on the extreme left, the 8th Corps, after reaching the German front line, was driven back to its own trenches. The subsidiary attack made by the Third Army against Gommecourt completely failed, practically no damage to the German defenses having been done in the long bombardment. Let us descend from this general viewpoint into closer contact with a single division. The 8th Division, with all its 3 brigades in line, was to assault the Auvilliers Spur, the Centre Brigade up the ridge, the others through the valleys on each side. Both the valleys were enfiladed from the German positions at La Boisselle and in front of Thiepval. Against these 3 brigades stood the German 180th Infantry Regiment with 2 battalions holding the front defenses, and the 3rd Battalion in reserve north of Pozières. After allowing for battalion reserves, there were 10 companies comprising about 1,800 men to oppose the 3 brigades, together about 8,500 bayonets, of the 8th Division. At 7:30 the British artillery barrage lifted. The trench mortars ceased fire, and the leading battalions of all 3 brigades rose and moved forward, each battalion extended on a frontage of 400 yards. A violent machine gun and rifle fire opened immediately along the whole front of the German position, particularly from the machine gun nests at La Boisselle and Auvilliers, and almost simultaneously the German batteries behind Auvilliers placed a barrage on no man's land and along the British front line and support trenches. Here let the German eyewitness speak. The intense bombardment was realized by all to be a prelude to the infantry assault at last. The men in the dugouts therefore waited ready, a belt full of hand grenades around them, gripping their rifles and listening for the bombardment to lift from the front defense zone on to the rear defenses. It was of vital importance to lose not a second in taking up position in the open to meet the British infantry, who would be advancing immediately behind the artillery barrage. Looking towards the British trenches through the long trench periscopes held up out of the dugout entrances, there could be seen a mass of steel helmets above their parapet, showing that their storm troops were ready for the assault. At 7:30 a.m. the hurricane of shells ceased as suddenly as it had begun. Our men at once clambered up the steep shafts leading from the dugouts to daylight and ran singly or in groups to the nearest shell craters. The machine guns were pulled out of the dugouts and hurriedly placed into position, their crews dragging the heavy ammunition boxes up the steps and out to the guns. A rough firing line was thus rapidly established. As soon as in position, a series of extended lines of British infantry were seen moving forward from the British trenches. The first line appeared to continue without end to right and left. It was quickly followed by a second line, then a third and fourth. They came on at a steady, easy pace, as if expecting to find nothing alive in our front trenches. The front line, preceded by a thin line of skirmishers and bombers, was now halfway across no man's land. "Get ready" was passed along our front from crater to crater, and heads appeared over the crater edges as final positions were taken up for the best view and machine guns mounted firmly in place. A few minutes later, when the leading British line was within 100 yards, the rattle of machine gun and rifle fire broke out from along the whole line of craters. Some fired kneeling as to get a better target over the broken ground, while others, in the excitement of the moment, stood up regardless of their own safety to fire into the crowd of men in front of them. Red rockets sped up into the blue sky as a signal to the artillery, and immediately afterwards a mass of shells from the German batteries in rear tore through the air and burst among the advancing lines. Whole sections seemed to fall, and the rear formations, moving in closer order, quickly scattered. The advance rapidly crumpled under this hail of shells and bullets. All along the line, men could be seen throwing their arms into the air and collapsing never to move again. Badly wounded rolled about in their agony, and others, less severely injured, crawled to the nearest shell hole for shelter. The British soldier, however, has no lack of courage, and once his hand is set to the plough, he is not easily turned from his purpose. The extended lines, though badly shaken and with many gaps, now came on all the faster. Instead of a leisurely walk, they covered the ground in short rushes at the double. Within a few minutes the leading troops had reached within a stone's throw of our front trench, and while some of us continued to fire at point-blank range, others threw hand grenades among them. The British bombers answered back, while the infantry rushed forward with fixed bayonets. The noise of battle became indescribable. The shouting of orders and the shrill British cheers as they charged forward could be heard above the violent and intense fusillade of machine guns and rifles and the bursting bombs, and above the deep thundering of the artillery and the shell explosions. With all this were mingled the moans and groans of the wounded, the cries for help, and the last screams of death. Again and again the extended lines of British infantry broke against the German defense like waves against a cliff, only to be beaten back. It was an amazing spectacle of unexampled gallantry, courage, and bulldog determination on both sides. Footnote: in Die Schwaben an der Ancre by Gerster. End of footnote. At several points the British, who had survived the awful firestorm, broke into the German trenches. They were nowhere strong enough to maintain their position, and by 9 o'clock the whole of the troops, who were still alive and unwounded, were either back in their own front-line trenches or sheltering in the shell holes of no man's land, or cut off and desperately defending themselves in the captured German trenches. A renewed attack was immediately ordered by divisional headquarters. But the brigadiers reported they had no longer the force to attempt it. A fresh brigade was sent from the 3rd Corps headquarters. But before it could share the fate of the others, all signs of fighting inside the German trenches by the British, who had entered them, had been extinguished, and the orders to renew the assault were cancelled. Here are some losses. The 2nd Middlesex, 22 officers and 592 other ranks. The 2nd Devons, 16 officers and 418 other ranks. 2nd West Yorks, 16 officers and 490 other ranks. 2nd Berkshire, 20 officers and 414 other ranks. 2nd Lincoln, 20 officers and 434 other ranks. 1st Irish Rifles, 17 officers, 411 other ranks. 8th KOYLI, 25 officers, that is all of them, 522 other ranks. 8 York and Lancaster, 23 officers, 613 other ranks. 9th York and Lancaster, 23 officers and 517 other ranks. 11th Sherwood Foresters, 20 officers and 488 other ranks. In all, the division lost in little more than 2 hours 218 out of 300 officers and 5,274 other ranks out of 8,500, who had gone into action. By the evening of July 1, the German 180th Infantry Regiment was again in possession of the whole of its trenches. Its losses during the day's fighting had been 8 officers and 273 soldiers killed, wounded, and missing. Only 2 of its 3 battalions had been engaged. It had not been necessary to call the reserve battalion to their aid. Night closed over the still thundering battlefield. Nearly 60,000 British soldiers had fallen, killed or wounded, or were prisoners in the hands of the enemy. This was the greatest loss and slaughter sustained in a single day in the whole history of the British Army. Of the infantry who advanced to the attack, nearly half had been overtaken by death, wounds, and capture. Against this, apart from territory, we had gained 4,000 prisoners and a score of cannon. It needs some hardihood for Colonel Boriston to write, footnote, in Sir Douglas Haig's command, page 103, end of footnote. The events of July 1 bore out the conclusions of the British Higher Command and amply justified the tactical methods employed. The extent of the catastrophe was concealed by the censorship, and its significance masked by a continuance of the fighting on a far smaller scale, 4 divisions alone being employed. The shattered divisions on the left were placed under General Gough, whose command, originally designated the Reserve Corps and intended to receive resting divisions, was renamed the Reserve Army and given orders to maintain a slow and methodical pressure on the enemy's front. Henceforward the battle degenerated into minor operations, which proceeded continuously on a comparatively small front. The losses were, however, in this phase more evenly balanced, as the Germans delivered many vigorous counterattacks. To sum up the results of the fighting of these 5 days, says Haig with severe accuracy, footnote, in Sir Douglas Haig's dispatches on page 27, end of footnote, on a front of over 6 miles our troops had swept over the whole of the enemy's first and strongest system of defense. They had driven him back over a distance of more than a mile, and had carried 4 elaborately fortified villages. These gains had, however, been purchased by the loss of nearly 100,000 of our best troops. The battle continued. The objectives were now pulverized villages and blasted woods, and the ground conquered was at each stage so limited both in width and depth as to exclude any strategic results. On July 14, a dawn attack towards Bazentin-les-Grands led to a local success, and the world was eagerly informed that a squadron of the 7th Dragoon Guards had actually ridden on their horses as far as High Wood, whence they were withdrawn the next day. The enemy's second main system of defense, writes Sir Douglas Haig, footnote, in Sir Douglas Haig's dispatches, pages 30 to 31, end of footnote, had been captured on a front of over 3 miles. We had forced him back more than a mile. 4 more of his fortified villages and 3 woods had been wrestled from him by determined fighting, and our advanced troops had penetrated as far as his 3rd line of defense. Unfortunately, the enemy had dug and wired many new trenches, both in front and behind his original front lines. He had also brought up fresh troops, and there was no possibility of taking him by surprise. The task before us was therefore a very difficult one. At this juncture, its difficulties were increased by unfavorable weather. Footnote, in Sir Douglas Haig's dispatches, page 33, end of footnote. As the divisions which had been specially prepared for the battle were successively shot to pieces and used up, their remnants were sent to hold the trenches in the quiet portions of the front, thus setting free other divisions not previously engaged, for their turn in the furnace. It was not until July 20 that the battle again expanded to the proportions of a great operation. On this day, and the 2 days following, a general attack was organized by 17 British and French divisions on the front Pozières-Foucaulcourt. The losses were again very heavy, particularly to the British. Only a few hundred yards were gained upon the average along the front. The conflict sank once more to the bloody but local struggles of 2 or 3 divisions repeatedly renewed as fast as they were consumed, and consumed as fast as they were renewed. By the end of July, an advance of about 2.5 miles had been made on a front which at this depth did not exceed 2 miles. For these gains, 171,000 British soldiers had fallen, killed or wounded. Footnote. That is, 196,000 minus 25,000 for the quiet sectors. In the military effort, monthly returns, pages 253 and following. End of footnote. 11,400 German prisoners had been captured, but more than double that number of British prisoners and wounded had fallen into the hands of the enemy, of whom many had, under the terrible conditions of the battle, perished between the fighting lines beyond the aid of friend or foe. The anatomy of the battles of Verdun and the Somme was the same. A battlefield had been selected. Around this battlefield walls were built, double, triple, quadruple, of enormous cannon. Behind these, railways were constructed to feed them, and mountains of shells were built. All this was the work of months. Thus the battlefield was completely encircled by thousands of guns of all sizes, and a wide oval space prepared in their midst. Through this awful arena, all the divisions of each army, battered ceaselessly by the enveloping artillery, were made to pass in succession, as if they were the teeth of interlocking cog-wheels grinding each other. For months after month, the ceaseless cannonade continued at its utmost intensity, and month after month the gallant divisions of heroic human beings were torn to pieces in this terrible rotation. Then came the winter, pouring down rain from the sky to clog the feet of men and drawing veils of mist before the hawk eyes of their artillery. The arena, as used to happen in the Colosseum in those miniature Rome days, was flooded with water. A vast sea of incensient mud, churned by thousands of vehicles, by hundreds of thousands of men and millions of shells, replaced the blasted dust. Still the struggle continued. Still the remorseless wheels revolved. Still the auditorium of artillery roared. At last the legs of men could no longer move. They wallowed and floundered helplessly in the slime. Their food, their ammunition lagged behind them along the smashed and choked roadways. As the battle progressed, the conditions of offense and defense became more equal. Trenches were obliterated and barbed wire pulverized. The combats tended increasingly to become field actions in a wilderness of shell holes. The enemy's losses grew as the weeks wore on. The battle flared up again into a great operation on September 25 and the following days. And November 13 saw large-scale attacks along the Ancre tributary and the brilliant storm of Beaumont-Hamel. Although the Germans used and risked at almost every stage much smaller numbers of men than the attacking British, the experience of defense for these smaller numbers were probably even more terrible than for the attack, and the moral effect upon the German army of seeing position after position, trench after trench, captured and its defenders slaughtered or made prisoners was undoubtedly deeply depressing. While the British, in spite of their far greater losses, felt themselves to be constantly advancing and were cheered by captures of trophies and prisoners, the steadfast German soldiery could not escape the impression that they were being devoured piecemeal by the stronger foe. The effect was lasting. German shock troops and assault divisions were in later campaigns to show the highest qualities and achieve wonderful feats of arms. But never again did the mass of German rank and file fight as they fought on the Somme. The German 27th Division, which defended Guillemont, was one of the best divisions here engaged. Its history says, "Incontestably a culminating point was reached at the Somme that was never again approached. What we experienced surpassed all previous conception. The enemy's fire never ceased for an hour. It fell day and night on the front line and tore fearful gaps in the ranks of the defenders. It fell on the approaches to the front line and made all movement towards the front hell. It fell on the rearward trenches and the battery positions and smashed up men and material in a manner never seen before or since. It repeatedly reached even the resting battalions far behind the front and there occasioned exceptionally painful losses, and our artillery was powerless against it. And again, in the Somme fighting of 1916, there was a spirit of heroism which was never again found in the division. However conspicuous it, the division, remained until the end of the war. The men in 1918 had not the temper, the hard bitterness and spirit of sacrifice of their predecessors. Footnote: in die 27. Infanteriedivision im Weltkrieg. End of footnote. As the attackers became more experienced, the system of deep dugouts turned against the Germans. The intent troops, wrote Ludendorff, footnote, in My War Memories, page 244, end of footnote, worked their way further and further into the German lines. We had heavy losses in men and material. At that time, the front lines were still strongly held. The men took refuge in dugouts and cellars from the enemy's artillery fire. The enemy came up behind their barrage, got into the trenches and villages before our men could crawl out from their shelter. A continuous yield of prisoners to the enemy was the result. The strain on physical and moral strength was tremendous, and divisions could only be kept in the line for a few days at a time. The number of available divisions was shrinking. Units were hopelessly mixed up. The supply of ammunition was getting steadily shorter. The situation on the Western Front gave cause for greater anxiety than I had anticipated. But at that time I did not realize its full significance. It was just as well, otherwise I could never have had the courage to take the important decision to transfer still more divisions from the heavily engaged Western Front to the Eastern in order to recover the initiative there and deal Romania a decisive blow. The increasing sense of dominating the enemy and the resolute desire for a decision at all costs led in September to a most improvident disclosure of the Caterpillar vehicles. The first of these had early in January been maneuvered in Hatfield Park in the presence of the King, Lord Kitchener, and several high authorities. Lord Kitchener was sceptical, but Mr. Lloyd George was keen, and the British headquarters mildly interested. 50 of these engines, developed with great secrecy under the purposely misleading name of tanks, had been completed. They arrived in France during the early stages of the Battle of the Somme, for experimental purposes and the training of their crews. When it was seen how easily they crossed trenches and flattened out entanglements made for trial behind the British line, the force of the conception appealed to the directing minds of the army. The headquarters staff, hitherto so lukewarm, now wished to use them at once in the battle. Mr. Lloyd George thought this employment of the new weapon in such small numbers premature. He informed me of the discussion which was proceeding. I was so shocked at the proposal to expose this tremendous secret to the enemy upon such a petty scale, and as a mere make-weight to what I was sure could only be an indecisive operation, that I sought an interview with Mr. Asquith, of whom I was then a very definite opponent. The Prime Minister received me in the most friendly manner, and listened so patiently to my appeal that I thought I had succeeded in convincing him. But if this were so, he did not make his will effective, and on September 15 the first tanks, or large armored cars, as they were called in the communiqué, went into action on the front of the Fourth Army, attacking between the Comble ravine and Martinpuich. In a memorandum drawn up by General Winston several months before, when he was organizing the Tank Corps, it had been urged that the tanks should lead the attack, combined in as large numbers as possible, with large forces of infantry launched at once behind them. This advice was not accepted. The tanks, what there were dispersed in twos and threes against specified strong points or singly for special purposes. They were used as the merest makeweight. Of 59 tanks in France, 49 reached the battlefield, and of these 35 reached their starting points, of which 31 crossed the German trenches. Although suffering from all the diseases of infancy and with their crews largely untrained, it was immediately proved that a new factor had been introduced into the war. One siege tank, on this first occasion, finding the attacking infantry held up in front of flare by wires and machine guns, climbed over the German trench, and traveling along behind it, immediately and without loss forced its occupants, 300 strong, to surrender. Only 9 tanks surmounted all the difficulties and pushed on ahead of the infantry. Wherever a tank reached its objective, the sight of it was enough, and the astounded Germans forthwith fled or yielded. 10 days later, on September 25, another tank, a female, followed by 2 companies of infantry, cleared 1,500 yards of the Gurt trench, and took 8 German officers and 362 men prisoners, apart from numerous killed and wounded, with a total loss to the British of only 5 men. Let these episodes be contrasted with the massacre of the 8th Division already described. Meanwhile, to achieve this miniature success and to carry the education of the professional mind one stage further forward, a secret of war which, well used, would have procured a world-shaking victory in 1917, had been recklessly revealed to the enemy. Providentially, however, the scales of convention darkened also the vision of the German General Staff and clouded even the keen eye of Ludendorff. In the same way the Germans had exposed their secret plans of poison gas by its use on a small scale at Ypres in 1915, when they had no reserves ready to exploit the initial success. But their enemy did not that instant neglect the knowledge they were given. I turn aside from the narrative to examine a once keen controversy in which I engaged myself. During the whole month of July, the public and the cabinet were continually assured that the losses of the Germans in the Somme battle far exceeded our own. It is certainly necessary not to discourage by the publication of shocking figures an army or a nation during the progress of a great battle. But a government is entitled to know the facts from its servants. I held no official position at this time, but applying my knowledge and judgment to all the information I could acquire, I formed my own opinion upon the reports with which I was told the cabinet were being furnished. I said, of course, no word in public, but viewing with the utmost pain the terrible and disproportionate slaughter of our troops and the delusions that were rife. I felt it my duty to place on record my appreciation of the facts. I showed this appreciation when written to Sir Frederick Smith, footnote, later Lord Birkenhead, end of footnote, a member of the Cabinet and Attorney General, with whom I had been for many years on terms of the closest friendship. He thought it right to have it printed and circulated officially to his colleagues. I reprint it here with his covering note. In the course of conversation with myself, Winston Churchill asserted his views with regard to the offensive now taking place in the West. I am by no means wholly in agreement with his standpoint, thinking, as I do, that he underrates the importance of our offensive as a contribution to the general strategical situation. I suggested, however, that he should embody his views in a memorandum. He has done so. After careful consideration, I formed the view that the result would interest my colleagues and enable them to apply their minds to the situation, which develops from day to day with both the official and a critical view before them. I therefore circulate the memorandum. Frederick Smith. Memorandum. First, the British attack on the 1st and 2nd of July was upon a front of, say, 20,000 to 25,000 yards. The facts as now known, 27,000 yards. On nearly 3/5 of this distance it was repulsed. On rather more than 2/5 it advanced our lines about 2 miles. 14, in fact 15, British divisions were engaged, exposing, at about 10,000 bayonets each, 140,000 infantry to the full severity of battle. On the front attacked, the Germans had 8, in fact 7, divisions, of which 5, in fact 4, were in the line and 3 in reserve. Of the 50,000 bayonets comprised in the 5 divisions in the line, 20,000 were probably in the first system of trenches, 20,000 more in support, and 10,000 in divisional reserve. The 20,000 in the first system of trenches would be the chief sufferers from the bombardment, because they cannot move away from the positions bombarded, and we may assume 50% loss to them along the whole front, plus prisoners taken on the section successfully assaulted. 10,000 plus 4,000. The supporting troops can be moved about to avoid the shelled localities, and 25% loss among them to cover bombardment casualties and losses incurred in reinforcement or counterattack is a liberal estimate. 5,000. 10% is sufficient for the divisional reserves. 1,000. Total German loss in the first phase, 20,000, of which 4,000 prisoners and 8,000 killed died of wounds or disabled for the war, that is, half the remainder, represent permanent loss, 12,000. What were the British losses? They were certainly down to midnight on the 2nd of July, not less than 60,000, and of these more than 20,000 were missing, that is, killed, wounded, or prisoners in the enemy's hands. The Cabinet should require precise figures. On the above basis, however, the permanent loss might be calculated roughly as follows. Missing 20,000. Dead or died of wounds in our own hands at 25% of the remainder, 10,000. Disabled for the war about ditto, 10,000. Total British permanent loss, 40,000. Total German, 12,000. It is believed that both these totals are more favorable to us than the actual facts. Second, since the first attack, the fighting has narrowed to a front of about 7,000 yards and has become less one-sided owing to German counterattacks. Our total loss to the end of July is probably 150,000. In fact, 171,000. This is equivalent to half the effective bayonets of 30 divisions. How many divisions have been engaged? How many have been deprived through losses of an offensive value within the next 3 months? How many fresh divisions are there left? These are serious considerations. What of the enemy? Out of roughly 120 divisions, actually 120 and a half, west of the Rhine, about 35 were, before the battle, opposite the British and the rest opposite the French and Belgians. The two main concentrations were on the British front and against Verdun. How many additional divisions have been concentrated against the British during the progress of this battle, and where have they come from? We know that the whole front against us is firmly held. It has been tested at many points, and the enemy has himself shown enterprise and activity at many others. In particular, the Australian attack south of Armentières met with most formidable resistance, and our troops were expelled from the German trenches with a loss said to be nearly 3,000. The line opposite the French has also been tested at many points in its 400-mile length, and the front is found everywhere to be effectively maintained by the enemy. The Germans usually hold their lines with the minimum numbers consistent with safety, and it is not likely they can have removed any appreciable force from any part of the ordinary front. There remain only out of the troops west of the Rhine their general reserves, and the concentration in front of Verdun, who could be drawn on. How many divisions have been moved opposite the British from these two sources? Statements that the Germans have brought up 30 divisions opposite to the British should be distrusted. Where can they have come from? The fact that units of 30 divisions have been identified by contact, if true, is no proof. It may well be that individual regiments or battalions which were resting have been scraped from different parts of the line to meet the local emergency. But it is not seen how more than the equivalent 6 or 7 additional divisions can have been brought to the sector under the British attack. If this be so, the total German force successively or simultaneously engaged in the battle with us cannot exceed 14 or 15 divisions. In fact, the Germans scraped from the Somme to Rheims all the 3rd battalions which constituted the local reserves of sectors. They obtained thus about 13 battalions belonging to 8 different army corps. According to Lieutenant Colonel Cords, La Guerre Mondiale, page 174. By July 1, 7. By July 1 to 9, 2 more. By July 10 to 21, 5 more. By July 21 to 31, 2 more. In total 16. It is probably less. The diaries of German officers published show how numbers and reserves are stinted, and how much is expected of every unit engaged. The impression which these diaries produce is lavish use of superior numbers on the British side and rather callous sacrifice of very inferior forces on the German. In other words, they are maintaining their defense on the cheap and by minor expedients of reinforcement. Third, assuming, however, that as many as the equivalent of 15 German divisions have at one time or another been engaged in this battle against, say, 30 British divisions, how has the proportion of loss fallen on the two armies after the first shock? If out of 30 British divisions put through the mill we have lost in the second phase 90,000, the Germans, at the same rate, would have lost on 15 divisions engaged about 45,000. This would make the totals to date: British 150,000, Germans 65,000. Footnote: these figures give a proportion of British to German losses of 2.3 to 1. Sir Douglas Haig, in his final dispatch upon the Somme, committed himself to the following positive assertion: "There is nevertheless sufficient evidence to place it beyond doubt that the enemy's losses in men and material have been very considerably higher than those of the Allies." Colonel Boriston has now admitted the miscalculation which was made. "Such figures as are now available," he writes, "do not bear out this view so far as the British front is concerned." The total British casualties on the Western Front between July 1 and November 19, 1916 were some 463,000. A calculation based on German returns made available since the armistice state the German casualties incurred opposite the British during this period as about 218,000. In Sir Douglas Haig's command, 1915-18, page 149. Making an allowance which is certainly reasonable for casualties on both sides on the quiet sectors, Colonel Boriston states the actual British casualties in the Battle of the Somme at about 410,000 and the German casualties against them at 180,000. This yields the proportion of 2.27 British casualties to 1 German, or almost exactly the estimate of my memorandum. The headquarters staff estimates, dated August 1, placed the German loss in July at certainly not less than 130,000 men, as against my estimate of 65,000 at the same date. The Reichsarchiv's returns give the figure for July on the whole British front of 59,493. The British monthly returns show a British total of 196,000 for July. Deducting 1/8 from both for casualties on the quiet sectors, we reach the figures of German loss in July 52,000 and British 171,000. End of footnote. This is probably more favorable to us than the truth. Fourth, leaving personnel and coming to ground gained, we have not conquered in a month's fighting as much ground as we expected to gain in the first 2 hours. We have not advanced 3 miles in the direct line at any point. We have only penetrated to that depth on a front of 8,000 or 10,000 yards. Penetration upon so narrow a front is quite useless for the purpose of breaking the line. It would be fatal to advance through a gap of this small size, which could be swept by a cross-fire of artillery. We are therefore now trying to broaden the gap by attacking sideways to the north. This is a very slow business. In 4 weeks we have progressed less than a mile. Unless a gap of at least 20 miles can be opened, no large force could be put through. Even then, it would have to fight a maneuver battle for which neither its training nor the experience of its staffs had prepared it, under adverse conditions. But the month that has passed has enabled the enemy to make whatever preparations behind his original lines he may think necessary. He is already defending a 500-mile front in France alone, and the construction of extra lines about 10 miles long to loop in the small sector now under attack is no appreciable strain on his labor or trench stores. He could quite easily by now have converted the whole countryside in front of our attack into successive lines of defense and fortified posts. What should we have done in the same time in similar circumstance? Anything he has left undone in this respect is due only to his confidence. A very powerful hostile artillery has now been assembled against us, and this will greatly aggravate the difficulties of further advance. Fifth, nor are we making for any point of strategic or political consequence. Verdun at least would be a trophy, to which sentiment on both sides has become mistakenly attached. But what are Péronne and Bapaume, even if we were likely to take them? The open country towards which we are struggling by inches is capable of entrenched defense at every step, and is utterly devoid of military significance. There is no question of breaking the line, of letting loose the cavalry in the open country behind, or of inducing a general withdrawal of the German armies in the west. No local strategic advantages of any kind have been reaped or can be expected. The tactical form of the attack seems open to comment. Surprise, which played a vital part in the Russian victories and in the French attack, was wholly lacking. Nor was there that overwhelming concentration of artillery on particular points which characterized the German operations against Verdun. The sector selected for assault was one where the chalky ground enabled very deep entrenchments and dugouts to be made, and was therefore far less adapted to the first employment of our new and very powerful artillery than some other portions of the front. In personnel, the results of the operation have been disastrous. In terrain, they have been absolutely barren. And although our brave troops on a portion of the front, mocking their losses and ready to make every sacrifice, are at the moment elated by the small advances made and the capture of prisoners and souvenirs, the ultimate moral effect will be disappointing. From every point of view, therefore, the British offensive per se has been a great failure. With 20 times the shell and 5 times the guns and more than double the losses, the gains have but little exceeded those of Loos. And how was Loos viewed in retrospect? Sixth, it remains to consider the effects of this tremendous and most valiant effort on the general situation in the West and other theatres. It is too early to say whether the British offensive had forced the enemy to suspend during its continuance his costly attacks on Verdun. As soon as our offensive is definitely mastered, it will be open to him either to renew them or to use his successful defense against us as a cloak or an excuse for getting out of the job. No doubt the French are pleased. Having suffered so much themselves in blood, they think it is only fair we should suffer too. Their own attack on our right was a fairly profitable operation. This is the solitary advantage in the West. Nor can it be claimed that our offensive was necessary to the Russian successes in the East. Their greatest success was gained largely by surprise before we had begun. We could have held the Germans in our front just as well by threatening an offensive as by making one. By cutting the enemy's wire, by bombardments, raiding, and general activity at many unexpected points, begun earlier and kept up later, we could have made it impossible for him to withdraw any appreciable force. In fact, no important advances or captures were made by the Russians after the opening of the Somme battle. If the French were pressed at Verdun, we could have taken over more line and thus liberated reinforcements. Seventh, so long as an army possesses a strong offensive power, it rivets its adversary's attention. But when the kick is out of it, when the long saved-up effort has been expended, the enemy's anxiety is relieved, and he recovers his freedom of movement. This is the danger into which we are now drifting. We are using up division after division, not only those originally concentrated for the attack, but many taken from all parts of the line. After being put through the mill and losing perhaps half their infantry and 2/3 of their infantry officers, these shattered divisions will take several months to recover, especially as they will in many cases have to go into the trenches at once. Thus, the pent-up energies of the army are being dissipated, and if the process is allowed to go on, the enemy will not be under the need of keeping so many troops on our front as heretofore. He will then be able to restore or sustain the situation against Russia. Winston S. Churchill, August 1, 1916. The statements in this memorandum were resented and repudiated both in the Cabinet and at General Headquarters, to which a copy soon found its way. There is no doubt that I did not make sufficient allowance for the compulsion to an offensive exercised by the blind movement of events. The facts were, however, only too true. I have thought it right to thresh this controversy out in detail, to vindicate the claim which I make that I pass no important criticisms on the conduct of commanders in the light of after-knowledge, unless there exists documentary proof that substantially the same criticism were put on record before or during the event and while every point was disputed and unknowable. Sir Douglas Haig was not at this time well served by his advisers in the intelligence department of General Headquarters. The temptation to tell a chief in a great position the things he most likes to hear is one of the commonest explanations of mistaken policy. An emperor, a commander-in-chief, even a prime minister in peace or war, is in the main surrounded by smiling and respectful faces. Most people who come in contact with him in times of strain feel honored by contact with so much power or in sympathy with the bearer of such heavy burdens. They are often prompted to use smooth processes, to mention some favorable item, to leave unsaid some ugly misgiving or some awkward contradiction. Thus, the outlook of the leader on whose decision fateful events depend is usually far more sanguine than the brutal facts admit. In political life there are many correctives. There is no walk so crowded with candid friends as Parliament. Apart from this, there is in time of peace organized opposition which with tireless industry assembles all the worst possible facts, draws from them the most alarming conclusions, and imputes the most unworthy motives. But the head of a great army in time of war has no such balancing apparatus. His power over his subordinates is practically absolute. Their loyalty, their sense of discipline lead them to try to win his favor, or at least to spare his feelings, on every occasion. A sign of displeasure on his part at some objectionable piece of news might easily be interpreted by a subordinate as a wish to be freed from such inflictions. The whole habit of mind of a military staff is based upon subordination of opinion. It is not every counsellor who, like the bastard in King John, will say to his sovereign, "But if you be afeard to hear the worst, then let the worst unheard fall on your head." Yet, when events are surveyed in retrospect, it does not seem just to throw the reproach of this battle upon Sir Douglas Haig. The esoteric Buddhists believe that at the end of each life a new being is created, heir to the faults of the virtues of his forerunner. The tragedies of 1916 had been decreed by the events of 1915, the failure of the Allied governments in that year to effect the destruction of Turkey and the union of the Balkans against the Central Powers left open no favorable means of action. The French agony at Verdun compelled a British relieving counterattack in France, before the new British armies, and particularly their vastly expanded artillery, were sufficiently trained to save the assaulting troops the heaviest loss. The tanks, though already conceived, had yet to be born and reared. Resources did not exist sufficient to mount simultaneously several offensives along the battlefront, thus leaving the enemy uncertain to the last moment of the true point of attack. Indispensable preparation destroyed equally indispensable surprise. Yet the call to attack was peremptory. Delay was impossible. Sir Douglas Haig, like all the commanders on the Western Front, would no doubt, had he been responsible, have opposed the great turning movement in the south-east of Europe which was possible in 1915, and the consequence of which alone could have yielded decisive results in 1916. He was also confident and convinced of breaking the German front upon the Somme. But had he been as reluctant as he was ardent to attack the German positions, he could not have remained idle. Inexorable forces carried rulers and ruled along together, as the wheels of fate revolved. Nevertheless, the campaign of 1916 on the Western Front was from beginning to end a welter of slaughter, which, after the issue was determined, left the British and French armies weaker in relation to the Germans than when it opened, while the actual battle fronts were not appreciably altered, and except for the relief of Verdun, which relieved the Germans no less than the French, no strategic advantage of any kind had been gained. The German unwisdom in attacking Verdun was more than cancelled in French casualties, and almost cancelled in the general strategic sphere by the heroic prodigality of the French defense. The loss in prestige which the Germans sustained through their failure to take Verdun was to be more than counterbalanced by their success in another theatre, while all the time they kept their battlefront unbroken on the Somme. But this sombre verdict, which it seems probable posterity will endorse in still more searching terms, in no way diminishes the true glory of the British Army. A young army, but the finest we have ever marshalled, improvised at the sound of the cannonade, every man a volunteer, inspired not only by love of country, but by a widespread conviction that human freedom was challenged by military and imperial tyranny. They grudged no sacrifice, however unfruitful, and shrank from no ordeal, however destructive. Struggling forward through the mire and filth of the trenches, across the corpse-strewn crater fields, amid the flaring, crashing, blasting barrages and murderous machine-gun fire, conscious of their race, proud of their cause, they seized the most formidable soldiery in Europe by the throat, slew them and hurled them unceasingly backward. If 2 lives or 10 lives were required by their commanders to kill one German, no word of complaint ever rose from the fighting troops. No attack, however forlorn, however fatal, found them without ardor. No slaughter, however desolating, prevented them from returning to the charge. No physical conditions, however severe, deprived their commanders of their obedience and loyalty. Martyrs not less than soldiers, they fulfilled the high purpose of duty with which they were imbued. The battlefields of the Somme were the graveyards of Kitchener's army. The flower of that generous manhood which quitted peaceful civilian life in every kind of workaday occupation, which came at the call of Britain, and, as we may still hope, at the call of humanity, and came from the most remote parts of her empire, was shorn away forever in 1916. Unconquerable except by death, which they have conquered. They have set up a monument of native virtue which will command the wonder, the reverence and the gratitude of our island people as long as we endure as a nation among them.